Boom, recording.
The only thing I feel like I haven't said is the etiquette of the podcast, which is that there is no etiquette and you should interrupt, break in, free-flowing
totally
conversation.
Right. You should absolutely do that.
I see what you did there, Tennant.
Because what happens, and this is particularly the case for Tennant and I, if someone doesn't interrupt us, we'd go on and on and on.
That's what Frankie meant about leaving you unsupervised. I get it.
But, you know, I mean, this is just Tennant, Luke and Frankie dynamic. The Tennant, Luke and Alison dynamic might be entirely different. Who knows? I don't know.
There's only one way to find out.
Cue introduction music. Because you guys sing that, right? That's what Frankie told me.
This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording today on Wurundjeri land. Frankie is out for a few weeks, but never fear. Helping hold the pod fort is the exceptional Alison Reeve. Hello, Alison.
Hi, Luke. Hey, Tennant.
Great to have you with us. And joining a man with a dream that this very podcast will one day release a Dungeons & Dragons bonus episode. Tennant Reed. G'day, Tennant.
I think that there's a lot of opportunity to work climate and energy themes, maybe into a D&D session, maybe into a Call of Cthulhu session where horrible knowledge that humankind was not meant to hold sends investigators screaming insanely into the night.
So, Alison, as you make the transition from listener to host, I think that the experience of the Let Me Sum Up listener is still very present with you. Would you be excited by a D&D themed Let Me Sum Up episode?
No, not in the slightest. I have never played D&D. However, I do know it's slightly pertinent perhaps to today's episode without wanting to front run what we're going to talk about. Isn't there some board game about where you get to design an energy market and then run it?
There is.
We were talking about that just last week, right, Tennant?
I think that's a sign that we're great big nerds. But yes.
Spoiler alert.
There is. At least one. It's called Power Grid.
That's it, Power Grid. Yes.
And you were saying, Tennant, that it's pretty good.
I wasn't saying it because while I am a great big nerd, I've never played that one.
We were talking to a mutual acquaintance.
But I've heard good things.
I haven't played it either, but I do know people whose marriages have deteriorated as a result of particularly intense sessions of Power Grid. But this is what happens when you get two energy nerds marrying each other, right? So
yes, always dangerous, always dangerous. Hey, I think that we need to put another option on the listener survey. Well, not D&D playthrough, but a Power Grid playthrough, which could be more on topic, actually, if one thinks about it. But that is an excellent segue into something which I've been asked to do. I've got a memo here from Global VP Frankie Muscovich, who is not on this episode, but has directed us to mention that our listener survey is out there. Early results have been very interesting. One of the things we've been watching closely, Tennant and Alison, is listener preferences on episode length. Anecdotally, we have heard that there are at least a cohort of listeners that love the show, but would deeply appreciate if the episodes were a little bit shorter. So we were surprised and briefly vindicated when the early results found that there was a strong consensus for 1 hour or longer shows.
Yeah.
And until we realised that because we announced the listener survey past the 1 hour mark, all the people who preferred shorter shows probably weren't listening.
I don't agree with this interpretation at all, Luke. I see that anecdata claiming that people want more bite-sized digestible episodes have been totally exploded by a flood of hard data that says you, gentle listeners, are giving us license to talk for as long as we possibly can. And if you don't agree with that interpretation, then answer the survey and tell us we're wrong.
I think we're conducting a natural experiment here, right? We have tried once at the beginning of the podcast, once at the end of the podcast, and we will see what happens in the sample between now and then.
I like that. It does imply that we should have a baby bear episode next time where in the exact middle of the podcast we deliver the message again.
Well, it also implies you should have a parallel universe where you don't run the survey at all and you see what happens to episode length and audience size in that one, just to be really short.
I like that very much.
That's true. I'm not sure how we achieve that, but I'll toss that back into the global VP's court to consider that.
Yeah, she's not doing anything. Figure out how to run a parallel universe.
Parallel universe surveys. That sounds like something that will intrigue the Muscovich noggin. So a link in the show notes. If you want shorter episodes, make your voice heard. But as Tennant says, if you want longer episodes, don't vacate the field to the shorter episode people. That's enough of business. Let's get on to the opening topic, which is about the intergenerational report. The Australian government has indeed released an intergenerational report. This is a regular opportunity for the boffins at Treasury to engage in some economic crystal ball gazing and consider how a variety of megatrends might change the shape of the Aussie economy some 40 years hence. The latest report is out, and Tennant, it has quite a bit to say about the implications of climate change for the Australian economy.
It does. So an intergenerational report is a big document. It has got a lot of stuff in it. This one has a good 40 pages of its, 260 odd on climate-related matters. And, I would say it's a creditable effort, but could do better. Room for improvement and refinement in future goes. They only do these things every 5 years, but we are going to get some relevant products out of a couple of other reviews that are underway. This one is notable for going into much more depth than any previous IGR on both the impacts of climate change itself under different scenarios on the economy. And, as is usual when you get an economistic view of climate change, it reads as really weird to be noting various horrible impacts of extreme heat on human health and then saying, this might take 0.9% off service sector output and productivity by 2063. Yeah. That's just the nature of the exercise to some degree. But it does go through that stuff, and it goes through a bit of the opportunities and the economic headwinds involved in global efforts to achieve the Paris temperature goals. I would say on both of these fronts, it's like putting a flag in the sand of these are things that matter for our analysis, but the actual material, the scope of what they've been able to incorporate is pretty limited so far. The range of climate risks considered is narrow, and I have my doubts about the adequacy of even within that narrow scope of the handling of them. That 0.9% lower services sector output by 2063 was the outer limits of the impact range for a scenario where global warming's on track to exceed 4 degrees by 2100, which is the kind of scenario where, like, the far end of it, you get scientist-type people, not economist or political scientist type people saying, well, we don't understand how human civilization continues at that level of warming.
Exactly. It's at 4 degrees of warming, you don't have a service sector. You're all fighting each other with knives over a very limited water supply.
Yes.
And so you don't have a lot of time to think about lower productivity at your local coffee shop because your local coffee shop is not there. There is no such thing as a barista on a dead planet, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I don't think there's a dead planet function in the spreadsheet that lies behind that number.
Isn't that what a ref error is, essentially?
So are you suggesting that there is a point beyond which, economic metric mindset is not a particularly productive place to be taking the analysis? How do you resolve that cognitive dissonance? This is the frame that Treasury has for this exercise. What should they be doing if, beyond a certain point, beyond a certain temperature range, considering the productivity impacts of another increment of temperature rise is kind of futile because, we're in Mad Max territory.
Yeah, well, I think that the whole Immortan Joe economy in Mad Max is greatly in need of productivity boosting. But I think you need to do at least two things. One is the old classic, more research is needed. That is, there is a lot of scope for improving these estimates, incorporating more risks, more realistic treatment of risks. But I think the other thing is, and they're not too bad on this front in this edition of the IGR, is just consciousness of the limitations of your own analysis. They do repeatedly highlight, look, there's a lot of important stuff we haven't incorporated here. We know that. We know this is a lower limit on what the impacts may be. And I think the worst of past economic analysis has been that sort of unreflective overconfidence in your results, the sort of DICE model from our old friend Bill Nordhaus saying, 3 degrees of warming is the optimal level for global welfare. You should have more data than that, and there is more data than that in this report.
Well, I think that's the thing, is if you improve the quality of the data and you improve the quality of the modelling, I don't think you're going to find an upside to much of this. If anything, it's all going to feel a lot worse and a lot more scary. So if it does nothing else, if it triggers people to go, no, this is scary enough, thank you, let's get on and do something about it, I think then it's served its purpose.
Yeah. Look, I take all that on board. I think that there's a lot of work to do, and they have the opportunity to do that work over the next 5 years, I guess. I think the thing to bear in mind, though, is that, you know what, this is better than, it's better than the attempt to address climate change in the intergenerational report that came out a couple of years ago. So yes, Tennant, these things normally come out every 5 years, but the Albanese government saw fit to have another stab at the intergenerational report. I guess they saw some deficiencies with the one that was released in 2021. And in that intergenerational report, climate change is given shorter shrift. There's a lot less analysis. There's a lot fewer numbers. A lot of the same issues are actually acknowledged, but it's a subsection within a broader sort of environment chapter. It certainly isn't elevated, both in terms of the risks, which we've talked a little bit about, but there's also a substantive section in this chapter around the economic opportunities if we get this right as well, which is another important lens that, you know, is appropriate to bring to this whole question. It's another step, and we've seen this in a bunch of different places. The climate change statement that's now released on an annual basis reflects this. The work of the revamped Climate Change Authority in all these places, the task of explaining why Australia's response to climate change is both an effort in risk mitigation, but it's also a crucial economic reform agenda, and there are these huge economic opportunities, right? I mean, you've got to have that appropriate sense of the scary bits if we don't get this right, but also a sense of a positive future that we're all working towards to make this a politically practical project to pursue. I don't have any more P's in me, but let's leave it there.
Yeah, I mean, but between the good side and the scary side, I think when you look at both of those in the IGR, you see that we don't have enough policy either way to make that future come. You know, it really in some ways shows up the gap between where the current policy mix is and what you would need to do, both to address those massive risks and to achieve that bright future that they're starting to sketch out.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And something that I think would be particularly good to develop for the next IGR, or even maybe a special feature in a future budget, is to reach back into the mists of time to part of the original theory of the IGR, which was invented under Treasurer Peter Costello as part of the, let's be quite worried about the long-term fiscal situation. Let's not think we've slain the debt dragon forever, because sooner or later, economic circumstances are going to push down revenues, and they're going to push up the liabilities for intergenerational reasons. And boy, we need to be ready when that day comes. And life has turned out a bit differently. From there's an appendix at the back of this IGR setting out how projections have done on productivity, on participation, on a lot of things since 2002. But one of the things that would be very relevant to the future of this kind of exercise is bringing into sharper focus the climate debt that we are building up. That is the need for, in particular, negative emissions and net negative emissions down the track to counterbalance the slowness of reduction in emissions that globally and locally we're not reducing as far and as fast as would be needed to avoid 1.5 degrees of global warming without negative emissions.
Not just how much money we're borrowing from the future, but how many emissions reductions we're borrowing from the future as well.
Yeah, and those reductions are going to come at considerable cost in money and in resources.
Yep.
We kind of need to work out an interest rate on them, don't we?
We do.
Not volunteering, by the way. Way too hard.
Next Grattan Institute report.
No.
I'm sure everybody wants to read a report about climate interest rates. Although, people do get excited about discount rates, mostly in a hitting each other on the head kind of way. Debt bomb scaremongering is part of the heritage of the intergenerational report, and there's an opportunity there for a maybe not scaremongering, but a well-considered debt bomb campaign of consciousness raising, because it's not a metaphor. It's exactly equivalent to the fiscal problems that governments have sought to keep abreast of and to manage and to make sure they don't grow too large.
Well, I think I've said on this podcast before that some sort of carbon cost that was more thoroughly grounded in the expected cost of carbon removal down the track could be very powerful. And as you say, Tennant and Alison, you can think about that in terms of debt, and it's something that companies are quite used to thinking through. That could be super, super interesting.
Not all debt is bad, but not knowing how much debt you're taking on or how you're going to pay it back is not great. That's my nuanced message about debt.
Thanks, Tennant.
This message brought to you by the Debt Management Council of Australia. Debt. Have you got enough?
All right. Shall we chat about a report?
Yeah, let's do that.
Dr. Ron Ben David is a highly respected economist, academic and public servant. Over a storied career, Dr. Ben David has held senior roles in the Victorian Public Service, headed the Secretariat for the Garno Climate Change Review, and spent over a decade as chair of Victoria's economic regulator, the Essential Services Commission. These days, he is a professorial fellow at the Monash Business School, and it is with this hat that he has weighed in on the state of energy market governance with a new paper titled Rethinking Markets, Regulation and Governance for the Energy Transition. In it, he contends that the institutions and market design that emerged alongside energy sector privatisation in the 1990s are no longer fit for purpose. In his view, the challenges of the energy transition are such that there is a real risk we find ourselves in an energy dystopia, and avoiding this outcome requires an urgent rethink of how we do energy system governance. Alison, you put this paper on our radar. What did you make of it?
It was interesting because, so sort of Star Wars style, we're kind of starting with the third episode in a series. So there are two previous ones, one of which I had read and then forgotten about, and the other one which I hadn't read. And so when I was sort of, going through this, I was kind of going, but you haven't said this, and then realised actually he said it in one of the previous ones.
He explained how Darth Vader got the way he was in one of the earlier papers.
He did.
I'll let our listeners work out who Darth Vader is in this scenario.
Answers on a postcard, please. Look, I think Ron's made a pretty good critique here that the way that we think about the energy market, it's, the skyhooks off which it hangs, the design, the regulations, the way we built the whole regulatory system were built for an energy system that doesn't exist anymore. They were built to reflect the concerns of the 80s and 90s and not the problems that we have now. They were built around a steady state system, which is not what we have now either. Yep. And so therefore they're becoming increasingly dysfunctional. And he's kind of calling for a reset that is based around these 4 what he calls pivot points. So he thinks we need to start thinking about coordination risk rather than cost and price risk, which is what we used to think about. We need to get a different idea about what value means. We need to be realistic about what we are expecting from consumers, but also perhaps what consumers expect of the market. And we also need to do a massive rethink about governance, because the way that we are governing this at the moment isn't working either.
And that is a huge theme in this paper. He's having a real go at the current regulators, right? The current energy market institutions. And to a degree, he's saying it's kind of not their fault, because they were created for a different job. They were created to extract efficiencies out of an energy system which had been established some 70 or 80 years ago. By the time we got to the 90s, was very stable. Both the inputs and the outputs were very well understood. People weren't sort of being crazily innovative about how to do energy stuff in the 1990s. It was, those big centralised generators and, running electrons along transmission lines to distribution networks and, into people's homes and businesses. And so you were able to eke out those efficiencies, and that was kind of a smart thing to do at that point. And in a sense, he's saying, well, we set up these institutions and these energy market rules to do a job with a system with a certain set of characteristics. The characteristics of that system have fundamentally changed and are only changing more over time, but we haven't changed the institutions and we haven't changed the rules or the way that we approach rulemaking. And in fact, one of his critiques is that instead of kind of rethinking the process whereby we manage that system, we just keep creating more what he calls plug and play rules. And he thinks that is it's an untenable way of approaching this task. One actually has to step back and completely rethink it.
So I agree that he's in some ways saying the situation is not the regulator's fault. They came from where they came from. You can't ask more than that. But he's also saying they're acting in ways that are weird, that are not responsive to the situation, in some ways that are irrelevant and just very confused. And he points particularly as a turning point or a lost opportunity to the period of the Energy Security Board, and particularly the NEM 2025 project, which was meant to come up with a long-term upgraded or evolved design for the electricity market. He points to that as an episode where they had their shot to come up with something that would convince policymakers that, yes, the econocrats have got it, the technocrats have got it. We can relax a bit and not keep with a cascade of interventions. And it didn't work. They didn't come to a coherent joint view, argues Ron Ben David, and policymakers weren't convinced, and the ESB has been replaced with something much narrower and less ambitious, and policy interventions, ahoy, it's not just going to be left to technocrats now. I think that's not an unfair critique. I think that the rest of stakeholder land maybe shares some blame too, because lots of us have proved unwilling or unable to move beyond the inherited framework, even while supporting specific policy interventions that kind of sit outside of it all. I think not that many stakeholders have been willing to formally let go of, for instance, the energy-only market in electricity, and say, oh, well, let's fundamentally redesign it. And maybe they've got good reasons for that reluctance, but I think everybody's a bit stuck.
I found that critique quite interesting of those processes and their failure, because I read that, having just read several pages of him explaining why these institutions are kind of fundamentally ill-suited to the job because of, the circumstances in which they arose, the way that they were set up and the job that they were given back in the 1990s and the 2000s. And to me, it seemed like that if you accept the logic that he's putting forward, they were kind of set up to fail. He's just spent all this time explaining why it's incredibly difficult for them institutionally to grapple with this new reality, how it assumes a certain type of steady state market. Could they ever have been the author of a new status quo? It's a lot to ask, and it's a lot to ask of stakeholders as well, quite frankly. Yes. The kind of deep thinking and, that galaxy brain that one requires to take a step back and say, well, we're going to totally transform the way that we approach this task, because the coordination challenge, and this is, I think, where the paper is in some ways the strongest, sort of really hammering home the fact that the coordination challenge in the energy market is so fundamentally different. So many more points of coordination right across the system that, the regulatory approach as it exists now is entirely unsuited to it. Okay, but what do you do instead? That is a huge question.
Yes. Just on your question about whether they were set up to fail or not, a lot of where the challenges come from at the moment are the fact that you've had this shift away from large centralised generation to decentralised generation, which is the shift from basically from coal and gas to renewables. It's not like renewables weren't around when they were first set up. And it's not like we didn't know about climate change. I think if you're going to critique them for failing on anything, I would say it's a failure of imagination. It was a failure to look at those things that were there and think, what happens if these get really big?
Yeah.
We had the first 100% renewables report in, 2012, I think. It was part of the whole deal to get the CPRS through the Senate. And that was, 5 years before the Finkel review. Like at no point, people sort of said, well, we've done that report now, and now we'll go back to doing what we were doing before. And I mean, maybe this goes to the way you set those regulators up. Perhaps you should have just written into each of their acts and keep an eye on the horizon for stuff that might be important at some stage, which is kind of what it feels like where his critique is coming from, is that there's a bunch of things that they didn't see coming and therefore didn't deal with.
I want to pull out something extra there, because I think from what we've said so far, dear listener, you might think that Ron Ben David's just having a go at the energy market design. But also he has a problem with regulation design, that we have a bunch of regulation that is designed to mimic what the effects of a competitive market might be if there were able to be one. So, for instance, in electricity and gas networks, these are natural monopolies, and the regulation is structured to try to deliver pseudo outcomes that are like what a competitive market might. And he's saying that both of these, the market design and the regulatory process, are broken or inapplicable in the new circumstances because crucially, we lack knowledge and certainty about many of the things that you would need to know in order to be able to calculate what an efficient outcome would be. And in that world, he says, we're going to need to give engineers and governments much more say in what happens rather than economists and technocrats. And I don't know, what did you two think about the capacity of engineers and governments to take up the torch that RBD wishes to pass them?
Oh, if I was going to, just to quote directly, one of the things he wants them to do is to map all the known and foreseeable transaction points in the future energy system and market, which feels a little bit beyond the capacity. I have worked in government, and I originally have an engineering degree, and I feel very inadequate to even being able to contribute to such a task.
And that's just the start of that work.
Yeah.
I think that's right, but I don't think he's talking about, someone in an energy department doing this. I think he's talking about governments actually properly taking on the kind of the centralised coordination role that they hitherto had pre-1990s. I think that's actually what he's saying. He's saying, well, you're half-pregnant governments. You're sort of in there. You're kind of doing all this ad hoc stuff. Regulators aren't up to it. You actually just need to suck it up. He sort of sounds like he doesn't really like it very much. He's sort of gritting his teeth, but he doesn't see any other solution because he thinks that the trajectory that we're on is going to end in an energy dystopia. If we're not careful, we're going to be in this horrible place in 2030 where people are powering their EVs with, diesel generators humming away on suburban streets around the country, right? And he thinks that's a plausible outcome and he says he is advocating for just doing whatever it takes. And he doesn't have confidence in the regulators anymore, and he doesn't see a better actor than government stepping back in and playing that centralised role. And so, that's the least bad outcome that he can identify. So he's going with it, right? And the other thing that is important to draw out here is that he is advocating for the move away from giving economic efficiency primacy in terms of the goals that we're pursuing. He says it's still important. Obviously, we want anybody that's, acting in this space to be interested in efficiency, interested in how efficiently we can deliver those services. But he said, look, it's this coordination risk, which is the flashing red light that we just won't be able to coordinate all these resources across the system. He doesn't use this phrase, but honestly, he's talking about, can we keep the lights on? Yeah. It's a dirty phrase at this point now because it's been used very disingenuously in our political debate. But he's basically saying, look, we actually have to be concerned about this, and we will lose all social license for this transition if we don't deal with it.
And he's got a lot of worries, and I think they're fair worries. In addition to the risk that the lights go out, he's worried about the risk that we set up arrangements on the story, the promise that they're going to be very efficient and deliver value to consumers and the system, and have no idea whatsoever whether that is true. Not only before the fact, but after the fact, have no idea whether actually we've set ourselves up to be taken advantage of by service providers who have no obligations, or by AI agents acting on our behalf that reinvent market manipulation without us quite realising it. He's worried that there's just a comfortable assumption that certain kinds of approaches, market approaches and pseudo-market regulation, inherently lead to the best outcomes, and therefore you just sort of focus on the inputs of what kind of system you're setting up and assume that the outputs will follow. I don't know if that's a completely fair critique of attitudes, but he clearly feels that very strongly.
But look, I think it's really important to note, I didn't agree with everything in this paper, and I'm still trying to really think through the implications of it. And there's some things that he raises that I don't even know what I think. But I'm so appreciative that someone with his level of knowledge and expertise, detailed understanding of, the current state of energy markets and governance, but also a deep appreciation of where we're going, and a clear commitment to, seeing this transition through, is putting this stuff out there, is challenging us to think outside of the box. It almost doesn't, in a way, it doesn't matter if he's right about everything. I think what this is a provocation to all of us. And, you mentioned Tennant before. Well, maybe it's not just the regulators that have been complacent. Maybe stakeholders have been, a little unwilling to let go of the previous regime. He critiques governments for kind of being half in and half out. It's a provocation to all of us to say, what the hell are you doing, everybody? We're clinging to these comfortable assumptions about how the world works, and the world is changing around us, and we need to do things differently. So whether he's got every point right about how we should do it differently, or indeed if he has a completely resolved vision for what that end state is, I think it is incredibly valuable provocation to say, we need to collectively work this out, and we are nearly out of time. Like, this is a pressing challenge, and this is not some, off in the 20 or 30 years things could be a bit shit if we don't work this out. 5, 6, 7, 8 years time, things could be really starting to be quite challenging for consumers, and so it is incumbent upon us to really start taking this stuff seriously.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other reason why I thought this paper was good too is because Ron Ben David was one of the architects of the original NEM.
Yeah.
And it's very impressive that he is both humble enough and self-aware enough to say, hey, that thing I came up with, it's not working so well anymore and we need to change it. Because part of the reason we're in the mess we're in, I think, is because there are people who haven't had the humility to do that, and they just keep doubling down on their old ideas.
Yeah. And speaking of, like Luke, you said this was a bit of a provocation as a paper. He delivered this paper to the conference of the Australian Energy Regulator and the rest. And, I don't know how it was received, but I saw some photos of him arm in arm with other regulator-crats, and they all seemed to be very happy to see each other, which is delightful. But maybe there is more flexibility of thinking emerging. Maybe people are more conscious that what used to work ain't working no more.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an appendix to this paper where he raises sort of a number of what he calls regulatory oddities, which is sort of where the regulators have kind of had to do a kind of respond right now thing in response to something that's coming up. And I mean, I think a lot of those have probably come out of, frustration with the fact of not having clear direction or not being able to move, and so they've just moved anyway.
Yeah.
I think my guess would be within all of those agencies, people know this stuff, right? People know they've got a knife and they're at a gunfight. They're, trying to dodge bullets the best they can.
Yeah. One of those oddities was the decision about the extent to which gas networks could do accelerated depreciation, given the emerging stranding risk. And Ron has some thoughts on that specific decision and some broader thoughts on what the hell are we thinking about with value, the consumer value and regulated asset base value around gas networks. There was quite a provocative section too. It's a big issue that it's a $12 billion issue that he's putting his finger on. And Alison, you've been doing some thinking about that very issue recently.
Yeah. I mean, look, to be honest, we thought about it and we thought about it and we thought about it and we thought, oh, this is really hard and we've got a report deadline coming. But
yeah. Yes, we noticed.
Yeah, thanks for picking that gap up when you did the podcast. But honestly, I mean, to some extent, I think, this paper doesn't quite go there, but the unsaid bit of this paper and the thing that we drew out in our gas report was that at some point you need to make a political settlement on this stuff so you can move forward. Yep. The NEM came out of originally a political settlement, the competition reforms of the 80s, the idea that we were going to, do these sort of sweeping national reforms across a whole bunch of things and that everybody would be better off. And that was, it was largely political decisions first and then they turned into regulatory things. The thing is we need to remake those political settlements, the sort of NEM that we need that's delivering what consumers want, that's keeping the lights on. And, he's sort of, I think, given 4 things here that he thinks you really need to think about. And I mean, one I thought that was really good was that he said, well, we need to think realistically about consumers. Yeah. Sort of saying our whole system is based around consumers being homo economists, right? They're economists, whatever. That everybody sits down and makes rational data-informed decisions regularly about how much energy they consume and how much they pay for it and at what time of day they do it and all of that sort of stuff. And we all know that's not true, right? Yeah. And one of the things that I think he is groping towards here is everything that we've learnt over the past probably 10, 15 years in a bunch of policy fields about behavioural economics and how people actually behave. Yep. And that we need to set the system up to reflect that. That the problem is not that consumers aren't behaving in the right way. The problem is that the system's not set up for the way that consumers are going to behave. Yeah. One of the things I liked the idea that he said that this is all part of keeping social license for this transition is to make sure that the system keeps working for the consumers. But I think that sort of missed out on the other big social license issue, which is all of the stuff around where do we put all these things? Where do we put the transmission lines? Where does all the new generation go? And I don't think it's a huge amount of comfort if you've got a transmission line outside your kitchen window to go, oh, but the lights are staying on. The social contract is sort of bigger than that. And the social contract is tied up with a lot of other things as well. Consumers don't think about all of this stuff in neat silos of energy market over here and my interaction with Centrelink over there. It's all government. It's all part of a social contract, and it gets very, very complicated.
Yeah, and I think he doesn't. You're right. He doesn't directly answer this. I think this is one of the many issues that are left to state governments to just grab and not just lay down the law, but like take some responsibility for making everything fit, making everything happen. He talks about the re-balkanisation of Australian energy policy and energy markets as a thing that doesn't matter if you're sad about it or not, it's clearly happening, and you've got to make all these little Balkan potentates internally consistent and coherent and taking responsibility for connecting up the different parts of what they're doing. It's a very distressing vision for people still steeped in original recipe NEM Kool-Aid. But he's saying, well, government's just going to have to make it work. And that includes finding a settlement on social license for building big stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of this too is go to that. So, when you end up in the final question, it's like, well, is this the death of the NEM? Everyone has a different idea of what the NEM is, right? For some people, the NEM is the dispatch engine. For some people, it's the rules and regulations. For some people, it's the governance structure. For some people, it's the poles and wires and the fact you've got interconnectors between states. And one place that, he sort of suggested that we should be looking at all of the things that we've got and testing them as to whether they can deliver against these ideas of coordination risk and being realistic about consumers. I think ultimately where that leads you is that a lot of them you would go, no, we'll keep this bit. It's very hard to imagine an energy market. And I mean, I don't know, maybe this is me being just steeped in this NEM, having been there for my whole career. It's very hard to imagine a NEM without the dispatch engine.
Yeah.
I think probably everyone listening who has had anything to do with the NEM will have their little list of I would kill off these 5 things out of the energy market rules tomorrow.
But nobody's got the same 5 things.
Exactly. No one's got the same 5 things.
And men said of Ron Ben David that he of all men knew how to keep Christmas and kept it best in his heart. Knew how to keep the NEM and kept it in his heart all the year long. Well, he's changed his mind.
I did like his 3 questions at the end in the conclusion. I actually drew it. It works as a decision tree.
Does the tech exist? Yeah.
And then if no, work on the tech. Yes, go to question 2.
Yeah.
Do we know how to design an efficient market? No. Do something, anything else. Determinative regulation, centralised procurement, direct ownership and provision, etc. And then the third question is interesting because if the answer to question 2 is yes, it goes to question 3. How reasonable are the assumptions underpinning the proposed market-based solution?
Yep.
Which I read to say, are you sure that you've got a market mechanism?
Do you have a market mechanism for people or for Homo economicus?
Well, I mean, I was also like, dude, you were there for the Gunner review. You know how hard it is to get an assumptions book signed off, right? And you're saying we should do this for every decision in the market every time. It's like getting people to agree on what reasonable assumptions are is just a world of pain. And it doesn't matter. I mean, part of his sort of whole thing with this was there's kind of groupthink really within the regulators. And the thing is, you will still get groupthink when you go into those assumptions because people are not very good at putting themselves into someone else's shoes. I mean, in some ways, I sort of saw this as like trying to add going to go deep on the whole like moral philosophy of public policy here, but it was putting like a John Rawls layer on top of utilitarianism, on top of Kantism, on top of Aristotelian flourishing, right? Because that Rawls question asks you to think, how reasonable are these assumptions and would I be happy with the outcome if I was the least privileged person to be affected by the outcome?
He also really sort of doesn't spend a lot of time on it, but seems to really diminish the likely role of the federal government. He characterises them as trying to find a role and really sees it as the job of state governments to, as he says, grasp the nettle and get properly back into this space and sort out these coordination issues within their own jurisdiction. I was thinking about that and thinking about the degree to which, if one was to accept his contention that this is really state government's job and they just need to step up to the plate, how suboptimal it would be if you had, 5 or 6 completely novel approaches to this transition. You maybe had some coordination to ensure that rail gauge issues were being dealt with, that you weren't having totally different approaches to technology or standards, but beyond that, everybody was coming up with their own stuff. It would be super inefficient. There is a bunch of elements of this that are best done at a national level, and the power of the federal government as a convener and, a source of support. This is an expensive transition, and there are things that state governments might not particularly feel like doing that they could be encouraged to do through the purse of the federal government as well. I think that I'm more optimistic than Ben David is about, the federal government continuing to play a productive role.
Yeah, I mean, there is considerable doubt about whether the states have got the fiscal capacity to do everything that is needed, and maybe they can reassemble their own sub-markets that mobilise the necessary resources. But the feds can help a lot, that's for sure. And the tasks of negotiating and agreeing changes like putting a harm minimisation element into the national energy objectives, which Ron Ben David is very keen on. Don't just consider efficiency, but whether you are creating the risks of significant harms and how you're going to manage those in the process of allowing for efficiency. He wants somebody to put that in, and that's the kind of change that needs a vigorous federal negotiator to get the consensus that's required. Ditto getting a statutory duty of care on energy service providers. So that, like, fiscally and diplomatically, they've got to be there, but his vision is very much yes, they're there somewhere. But meanwhile, the main action is all in new state fiefdoms.
I think the problem with those state fiefdoms, though, is that you have a bunch of the states are linked to each other. Like there are literally interconnectors between each state.
More all the time.
If each state is acting in their individual interest, you potentially end up with a situation of harm in one way or another, because that's not necessarily the collective interest. Yeah. And the thing that is different now to, pre the NEM is that you've got market participants who operate in more than one state, which you didn't have before. Yeah. And you can't go back from that. You can't sort of go to AGL and say, look, I'm sorry, you're going to have to choose between operating in Queensland and New South Wales. You can't be in both. I mean, maybe that, that means that there is some sort of role for a national approach, and the Commonwealth could play honest broker in that. Sometimes they've done that in the past and sometimes they haven't. Sometimes they wanted to deal themselves into the game more rather than, they wanted to take the penalty shot rather than being the referee. And, yeah, like you say, they've got the checkbook.
Yeah.
But they can't – but, I mean, they also just can't write the states blank checks for, yeah, sure, do whatever you want and come to us for the money.
Well, I agree that they can't, but are they kind of doing that at the moment through the capacity investment scheme?
Somewhat, but it's...
I mean, the cheque isn't blank, but it's not for publication.
Yeah, exactly. That's the problem with when you get into whatever it takes territories, it sometimes turns into as much money as you want.
Which opens up what I think is an interesting tension. I mean, one could argue that, while Dr. Ben David's trying to be very provocative, maybe he's not thinking big enough. Like he's sketching out a vision which says, well, the structures as they exist, not up to the task. We need to.
Do you want one world government, Luke?
Well, maybe we need.
You want to bring the United Nations in?
Maybe
to run
a one nation government. What if we're just throwing everything up in the air? Constitutional reform. Let's give.
Why don't we ask New Zealand to join, and then we could get all their hydro?
There wasn't a New Zealand politician that was putting their hand up on the way out of Parliament last week, saying that they should consider that. But let's not open up that can of worms. But there could be an argument saying, well, the federal government should have responsibility for this, those coordination issues would be much more straightforward to solve if they were being solved at the national level and we weren't having to deal with this state by state. I feel like what I took away from this paper was less about the failure of regulators and more about the failure of government. And the absence of government. So effectively, it's like he makes this point on the way through here that when they set up this effectively a standard microeconomic framework back in the late 90s, it had three elements, right? Like you had the markets to do the discovery of what an efficient outcome would be in any given scenario. Where there's market failures, you've got the regulator to deal with them. And he says, well, governments, they're sort of responsible not for very much. Like they can kind of step away and just let this machine whir along in the background and congratulate themselves and I suppose think about what they want to do with all the money that they made from selling their assets. It sort of strikes me that his characterization of governments at that time was like people in their Tesla who have put the car on autopilot and while it's rolling down the highway and they've got into the back seat. And just she'll be right. I'm just going to have a little nap, and then of course it's not right, and you're in the back seat, and suddenly things can get very bad very very quickly, and. What I took away from this paper was they left it on autopilot far too long, and that what has resulted in this flurry of activity, and that somehow we need to get their hands back on the wheel, because even if it is a problem with the regulators, it is the task of government to work out how they should be reconstituted or how their remit should be expanded, revised. If it is a problem of market design, having regulators and market bodies that are fit for purpose to take on that challenge is really, really important. Ultimately, it is the responsibility of governments to deal with this stuff, and thinking about that federal state interplay is part of that. But I came away fairly convinced that this is a task ultimately for government, and taking responsibility for it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be the ones that are considering all of these various, what did he call them? Coordination problems at given transaction points. They don't have to be the ones solving them, but they have to ensure there is someone that is, and that they are up to the task of doing that. And I don't know that that's quite where we are yet.
I went to see Oppenheimer last night.
Ooh.
And they had, without sort of any spoilers, I mean, we all know how it ends, right? But one of the things that was it's quite striking when you look at things about those last couple of years of the Second World War was that the people who were the protagonists in that war had to think about these two really different things at the same time. How were they going to fight the war and try and win? But then also, how were they going to secure the peace? What was the world that came after? And I think that's a sort of similar thing to what we've got here. We have energy ministers who are right, in the middle of going, well, we've got some coal exiting. We're not building renewables fast enough. There's no transmission. We've got everyone putting in rooftop solar and we can't stop them. But they also need to, and I mean, I think this is the sort of the call that Ron Ben David is making, is that you need to step back from that and go, what comes after? What comes after we solve the really immediate problem about when does a RARing close? Yep. And it's really hard to get people to think about that when they are in the heat of the moment. Yep. But if we don't think about it, all we end up doing is just fighting this like forever. It's going to be like, if you don't like how the energy market is now, it's going to be like this forever unless you actually figure out a way to make it a better, more functional market that is oriented towards solving the problems that we need to solve, and particularly the longer term problems. Because
it's just going to be one thing after another, right?
Yeah.
Like there's no respite certainly in the next decade or two. It goes to a point that you've made often, Tennant, that we're kind of lurching back into the space of big government, centralised coordination. Government's building stuff. And this paper says, well, if that's where we are, let's own it and do it properly rather than do it in this piecemeal or ad hoc way. I think there's a bit of sense in that.
Yeah. And the literary reference that occurs early on in this paper, quoting from Yeats's The Second Coming, can be read in a couple of ways in this context. So, if I'm sure listeners, you've read or heard The Second Coming. It is a very quotable poem for a feeling that everything is falling apart and dire, disastrous events are upon us. But it, can also be read in this context as like the overheated imaginings of people who just can't let go of the way things were, and see a new world stirring, see the government getting back into the heroic building stuff, maybe not in the most efficient way, game, as being like some rough beast slouching towards Bethlehem to be born. Maybe you just need to take a chill pill and a fresh look at the situation, get their head right, and maybe go to the 2024 Australian Energy Regulator Conference with some fresh new thinking.
And looping back to the IGR, there's one thing that we're all going to have to get used to, is that the old world is gone.
Yeah.
It's coming. This is all coming for the energy market now, but the same thing is going to play out, in the industrial sector. Same thing's going to play out in the agriculture sector. Same thing's going to play out in households, and we might as well get used to it.
As always, we close out the show with one more thing in which we all share something that is currently captivating our attention. Tennant, what have you got?
I've got a fun, bite-sized little video game called, and this is on point, I swear, Green New Deal Simulator, which is available on iOS and Android and Steam.
iOS? Who says iOS?
iOS, man.
iOS.
I feel affronted.
Did you say AEMO as well, Tennant?
Oh, deep cut, Alison, deep cut.
Well, anyway, Green New Deal Simulator is available on all major gaming platforms except, I guess, the Nintendo-verse. And it's a tiny deck-building game where you have to guide the world, but it's just the United States, through the energy transition by making decisions about what gets deployed when, and it's simultaneously like a fun game as a little game. Can you optimize your resources and make the use of the limited time available? And it's also great fun to go, oh, this game mechanic has got an idea embedded in it, an argument embedded in it about energy transition, and I really disagree with that. Isn't that fun? So I loved it, even when I was going, oh, I think this is greatly underselling the role that business and markets have to play here. But it's excellent. It could have been subtitled No Transition Without Transmission, the musical, because, boy, are you going to get nowhere without transmission lines in this game. And it's very good fun. I had a completely painless flight to Canberra thanks to Green New Deal Simulator by Paolo Pediccini. Thanks, Green New Deal Simulator.
There's multiple points in this episode where it sounds like we've started selling advertorial, Tennant.
Consider these testers for market interest.
I'm just worried that somehow, despite Frankie's efforts to try and come up with a business model for this podcast, you've just struck your own personal side deal.
Yeah, brazen corruption. No, I have never had any direct or indirect dealings with Paolo Pediccini or any agents, companies, representatives, or people in suspicious circumstances thereunto.
However, if Paolo Pediccini is out there listening and would like to make a donation to keep the podcast on the road, we would not say no, right?
Always up for some payola, Pediccini.
Well done. Alison, what have you got?
So my one more thing was to wish a very happy 19th anniversary to mandatory energy rating disclosure for residential properties.
Hooray!
Because it was on this day that we're recording, the 27th of August, in 2004, that energy ministers agreed to make it mandatory that you had to disclose the Energy Star rating at point of sale or lease. And with the help of one of my colleagues, I went diving into the ABS data of how many properties had sold since that time. The answer is 8.9 million residential properties have changed hands since that date. And only 159,000 of those included the disclosure of the energy rating because the ACT is the only state that's implemented the commitment. Another way to look at that is that there were 8.7 million missed opportunities to provide home buyers with relevant information at the point where they are about to make the biggest financial decision of their lives. It is very much my fond hope that when the 20th anniversary rolls around, these numbers look a little bit better.
And that is what is known in the business as a sick burn.
I feel ripped off. This segment started out like it was going to be a happy celebratory story, and it turned bitterly ironic.
Well, you can do something ironic next time, Tennant.
My one more thing isn't entirely unrelated. We talked about the phase out of gas connections in new homes in Victoria a couple of episodes ago, and it kind of set the hairs running in New South Wales, and the Premier Chris Minns ruled out the ban in the days following the Victorian announcement under intense questioning from reporters. But that's seen councils like the City of Sydney and Waverley Council exploring the options they have at their disposal to phase out new gas connections themselves. And I just wanted to say I think that dynamic in New South Wales highlights one of the virtues of the Victorian decision that we didn't talk about on the podcast when we talked about it. Because by taking a statewide approach, they've avoided the risk that you end up with this patchwork of planning regulations across the state as local governments move to fill a void created by the state governments, because there are plenty of local councils that have a deep commitment to action on climate change, have a clear sense that gas is unlikely to be a part of that long-term transition, and if the state government doesn't act, they will seek to do so themselves. So we'll see where we get to in New South Wales, but hopefully something closer to a clear policy direction, and possibly something more akin to what's been achieved in Victoria.
So I'm not sure if the New South Wales government needs to take the political flak that might be involved in making that clear call, because like every gas appliance market and gas system participant that I've spoken to in the last few weeks feel like Victoria's decision effectively is a national call because they're the largest market for those appliances. Doesn't matter what political leadership says elsewhere, like the range of what's available to consumers is going to follow what's happening in Victoria.
Yeah. So I think there's probably some truth to that, but it is very messy in the meantime, with a whole lot of different actors providing very different advice.
And New South Wales is also where the gas network's being expanding fastest. And that is actually because for a long time, the planning regulation, so basics, the planning regulation in New South Wales pushed you towards putting gas water heating in if you didn't put solar water heating in. If you couldn't afford solar, you got more points for that. And that was because it was literally cleaner, because New South Wales electricity was not particularly green. They're about to change that. And I mean, this will actually be interesting to watch, because in October there's a change coming into basics that will flip that situation with water heaters and mean if you're building a new home, it's going to be much more attractive to put in heat pump or electric water heating than it is to put in gas. And it's going to be interesting to see what that actually does to gas connections per se. They may not need to actually ban it, or they might just find that because of the stringency of basics, it just takes itself out of the equation, at least for new homes.
Which is what is happening in some places in Europe, where there is no actual ban, but the regulations are such that it doesn't make any sense to put in a new gas appliance. But regardless of that, I think one of the benefits of the clarity of the Victorian decision, it is starting the broader conversation with consumers about wherefore to gas. And in the absence of that, there's a lot of dirt being thrown up. It's running very hot on Talkback Radio in New South Wales. And it's being framed as like a classic,
cultural.
Yeah. So there's just a lot more space to have for that kind of view to take root, where there isn't sort of a clear evidence-based position being taken by the state government. So we'll see where that gets to. I think that's all we've got time for today. We're all on social media. You can have a yarn with us on LinkedIn, the social network formerly known as Twitter. You're there as well, Alison, still, I think.
Yeah, I know.
Keeping the dream alive.
Clinging on in the hope that it's going to flip back the other way and become good again.
The flame of hope is dying in my heart on that front, but let's see where it gets to.
Well, that and it's like it's a hassle to leave, man. You got to find another network. You got to find your people.
It's
you
true.
find that someone's taken your handle already.
All of that. But there's one way our listeners can get in touch with us. I'm going to test you, Alison. What is our email address?
It's letmesumuppodcast@gmail.com.
Oh, bow.
No, okay. Do not send emails to that.
Well, I mean, you could. I have no idea who's going to reply to you.
Because someone's taken your handle already.
That's right. You should go to mailbag@letmesumup.net.
I have no idea where I got the Gmail one from. Maybe that means I don't actually listen to the end of the podcast.
Oh, you're one of those. They do exist. And I wonder why. What possible reason could people not have to listen to the end of this podcast?
Yeah, because there's all this great content like you're getting right now.
Champagne comedy.
And we keep it very tight.
I'm gonna give you another go, Alison. What is our website and what's there?
I have no idea.
Okay.
You didn't tell me this was going to be on the test.
I know. Tennant?
Our website is letmesumup.net, and you can find our entire back catalogue of episodes all the way back to the dim and distant past of mid-2022, where we've covered so many topics, but always more.
Always more. Well, Alison, it has been a delight. We look forward to seeing you again next episode. But for you and for Tennant Reed, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Did anybody else feel when reading his appendix about
the batteries that conspire against us all and become kind of sentient?
Yeah, I felt that that one needed to be read out by Arnold Schwarzenegger as the T-800. At 8:32 a.m., AEMO scientists realised the batteries had become self-aware and desperately tried to pull the plug.
I was thinking the computer voice from Paranoid Android.
The first million years of energy market reform were the worst. After that, the second million years were the worst too.